Welcome to this podcast where, unlike where we go through a letter for the Ken Reads, we're actually joined here today by my colleague Amy and also with our special guest Mike, who is here to talk about the avoidant attacher experience. Because as a lot of you might know, we talk a lot about what it's like being on the receiving end of someone who has a severe avoidant attachment style. Yet, it's very unusual for us to actually really do an episode involving someone who's not only working on their avoidant attachment style, but also talking about demystifying some of the experiences and really having a deeper dive into being not only empathetic, but also just better understanding what this experience is like for someone who has an avoidant attachment style. So for today's episode, I am going to moderate and not talk nearly as much as I normally do. And I'm going to hand the floor mostly to Mike and Amy to discuss the experience of being someone with an avoidant attachment style. So with that all out of the way, Mike, would you like to introduce yourself? And then shortly after, Amy, I'd love to hear from you as well too.
Yeah, hey guys. Mike, relationship and self-awareness coach, helping people to understand their subconscious thoughts and behaviors and address them. Very excited to be here. Thanks for the invite, Ken.
You're very welcome. Amy, what about yourself? Where are you from and what are you up to?
Hey everyone. I am so happy to be working with Ken on a regular basis, and I do attachment healing coaching for anxious, preoccupied attachment styles, fearful, avoidant, leaning anxious, and I've become somewhat of a accidental breakup person. So, I love helping people through really hard breakups, especially with avoidance. Everybody knows those are pretty brutal. So I'm so happy to be here and really excited to chat with you and Mike.
Perfect. So getting this underway, I maybe just start with a general question. So for both you, Amy and Mike, respectively, what would be your own personal understanding of what it's like having, an avoidant attachment style, and how would you identify your attachment style?
Sure. I would be considered healing, fearful, avoidant, probably leaning more anxious. Before learning any of this stuff, any self-awareness, it's just extremely confusing. It's like, why can't I get it right? Why am I causing so much pain and feeling so much pain? And yeah, just finally discovering this and gaining that confidence in being able to get it right, I would say is just life-changing. Amy.
Yeah, I hear that, Mike. That makes a lot of sense. So my personal attachment style is fearful avoidant. I've done a good amount of healing work, so I'd like to say I'm mostly secure these days, but I was definitely like a flaming fearful avoidant, leaning anxious. Although believe it or not, sometimes I would swing over to a very avoidant side as well if I was with a more anxious partner. The experience of a fearful avoidant is excruciating and exhausting and chaotic. From what I've learned through my studies, from my experience in my avoidance and from avoidant clients, is that the avoidant experience is so much different internally than what it appears to be externally. And what
Mm.
I mean by that is, avoidants get this reputation for being aloof, careless, cold, uncaring, unloving, incapable of love. And I really don't think that that's true. And I know that being in a relationship with an avoidant person can produce a lot of pain and hurt. And I'm not excusing hurtful behaviors, but I think what people don't understand is that there is so much more innocence and wounding at the core of avoidant attachment style than we realize. And from my experience working with avoidance and even with my close friends and family who are avoidants, being in a relationship and even friendships and work can be a very lonely, confusing experience. And this is because mainly, I think, what we understand as secure and anxious people is that love is good, closeness is good, relationships are good and safe. And we move toward those things because we think they're safe and good. So we move toward them easily. And when you ask an avoidant person to move toward closeness, intimacy in a relationship, it's sort of like them walking toward a chainsaw in that we are wired for love, everybody, but vulnerability, closeness, and intimacy is very scary for avoidance because it sort of equated to hurt and shame in childhood. So I know I just said a lot right there, but that is, I think, some of the more important points that I've noticed.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that with closeness, people think that, for avoidant attachers, it's just a fear of commitment, that it's just a case of they're committophobes. They're not interested in being in a committed relationship when it's so much more complicated than that. And I think what you said, Amy, about closeness feeling like it's a chainsaw, rearing up against you is actually a very palpable description of that. Mike, in your experience, how would you describe to someone who's not got an avoidant attachment what it is like to have that fear of intimacy and closeness?
Sure. I mean, it's probably easiest if I get a little personal here. Not saying Amy should or anything, but I usually share my story with my clients if that's okay, if that's
Yeah.
acceptable here.
More than
Yeah.
fine.
So yeah, I mean, the easiest way to explain it is, you know, I had an alcoholic mother as a child. She left for rehab when I was 3. Dad remarried, got divorced again before I was 6. So that ultimately gave me these core beliefs of, people always leave. You can't trust people. I'm worthless. So until those are addressed, those stick with you. And you're operating off of those beliefs throughout your entire life, throughout your dating. Um, so those insecurities flare up when we get close to somebody, and you know, until you address those beliefs, you're operating off of them, and ultimately they come out. Your nervous system, when it's dysregulated, you just freak out and start behaving, start self-sabotaging, which ultimately, if you're dating somebody anxious, obviously is triggering them. And it turns into that horrible dynamic, that push and pull, and never ends well. So,
Yeah, and I think that if you've had an experience like that where you've got, an alcoholic mother who's left and also a father who's remarried multiple times, that template for stability and love has already been severely compromised at a young age. So you're definitely not going to feel secure in your idea of what relationships are like as well, too. Amy, in your experience, when you think of like that concept of like people will always leave, it's really interesting because I think we think of like people who are anxiously attached having, a fear of abandonment. But it's wild, I think, for people to not realize that at the core of avoidant attachment is a fear of abandonment, despite having that fear of intimacy. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And also, Mike, thank you so much for sharing. I think it's so valuable when people hear our stories, everyone. Um, it's so funny when anxious people hear that avoidants also have this fear of abandonment. They don't believe it. And they say, no, that's my thing. I'm the one who's scared to be left. Avoidants love being alone. Of course, they don't fear being left. And the thing is, when we've got attachment wounding alive, we're all just sort of our wounded inner children showing up to a relationship. We are being controlled and driven around by our woundedness in adult romantic relationships when we've got live attachment wounds. And so while anxiously attached people and some fearful avoidants have that fear of abandonment running in their conscious mind 100% of the time, they're very aware of it, right? They're aware of it, they express it, they speak about it, they're always thinking about it. But for an avoidantly attached person, that fear of abandonment, because of the nature of their wounds, is so subconscious and sometimes unconscious. So if you were to ask someone who's avoidantly attached, are you afraid of being abandoned? They would laugh at you and they might even get pissed. Like, how dare you suggest that I would rely on someone to the point where I would fear them leaving? And if you think about that, why is that? Well, because when you have an avoidant attachment style, closeness and vulnerability you don't trust it, you don't think it's real, and it's painful. Your first association of relying on someone and being close to someone is shame and pain, because when you reached out for your caregiver or expressed emotion or vulnerability, you were rejected. And that happened consistently enough that you developed this subconscious mechanism that you automatically detach from being vulnerable and being close to someone, and you don't reach out your hand for other people. So when you're in an adult romantic relationship, you do still have that fear of abandonment, because everybody has that. We're wired for connection, but you think that it's so shameful, that it is so buried, but it is still alive, and it is still sponsoring your self-sabotaging behaviors when you are avoidantly attached in relationships.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we're so good at covering it up, and it's what helped us to survive, you know. I mean, it took me 30 years to realize I was doing it, but that hyper independence, that is a strength to us. It's a literal threat to our survival if we give that up, and we're operating off of that. So it's so important to understand we do have that vulnerability deep inside. We just are petrified of showing it, you know.
Mm. On that note, when you say like you're petrified of showing that vulnerability, it's really interesting because as someone who identifies as leaning more anxiously attached, I've never associated vulnerability with like weakness or I'm going to die if I share my innermost thoughts. The thoughts that often come up for me when I'm dating someone is more of, and this happened in the past, was if I'm vulnerable, they will leave me. And it's often been a real pain in the ass where I felt sometimes like I can't express my truth in certain situations. And then later I realized, no, actually, it's very healthy for me. So going back to what you just said, Mike, where you say like, there is this sort of feeling of being petrified at the idea of sharing one's vulnerabilities. What might that look like for someone like yourself as opposed to someone who doesn't share the same experience as yourself?
I want to say it's mostly I would say kind of similar. It's like I'm afraid that if I do show my vulnerability that you're gonna leave me. Um, at least that's how I thought in this one example I'm thinking of in my past. Um, because we pride ourselves on that independence, right? So it's like if we show weakness, we are in danger. I don't, Amy, do you have a better example?
I hear you as you're speaking. I'm like, yes, yes, I totally resonate with that. Especially for fearful avoidance, which I know you and I share that. Um, you know, in childhood, when we are being hyper vigilant and we are in control, we are usually parentified, taking care of our parents, taking care of our siblings. The way that we stay safe as fearful avoidance is to be in control, is to have an eye on everybody and their feelings and predict everything, and we don't really have time to be vulnerable. It's never our turn to be vulnerable, and it's not safe to be vulnerable. And oftentimes there isn't a reliable enough adult who's in check with their emotions and who's regulated enough to hold space for us. So if we ever were to be vulnerable in childhood, we might have been shamed for it. It might have caused even more unsafety. So in adult romantic relationships, our nervous system is so wired to be rock solid and hyper vigilant and not really trust anyone. And but we're wired for love. And so there, our subconscious mind and our fears and our defenses are constantly at battle with our conscious human need for love and attention. And it is so hard to be vulnerable. It's almost like you might even think you're being vulnerable. Like you might be on a date with someone, be spending time with your partner, and think, wow, I was just really vulnerable. That was a lot. But then you get home and realize, wait a minute, I was masking that entire time. And I can tell that because now that I'm home alone, I can relax like a wet noodle, but I haven't relaxed like that yet with that person. And that is because we have just layers and layers of defenses built up. And that's, me speaking from the fearful avoidant perspective. And I think from the dismissive avoidant perspective, I think it might be even there might be 100 more layers to get down to that vulnerability. And that's one of the reasons why dismissive avoidance like to move so slowly in a relationship, because it takes, the more avoidant you are, the longer it takes to feel safe with someone, safe enough to be vulnerable.
Mm.
I Sorry, Kim. Yeah, just one more thing. Like I would kind of attribute it to our culture too. It's like masculinity, hyper masculinity in our culture. Men who express emotions are weak, etc. Pile on top of that a parent who tells you to suppress your emotions, not cry. Um, that'll do it. That'll make you very avoidant, I would say.
It's funny,
Oh
as you
my
were
God.
saying that, I was thinking of a few things that have come up recently in conversation with people who are avoidantly attached, where you know, I think that it's really interesting how there are a few things that I've heard avoidant attachers say where I think it really resonates with what you just said about the culture piece and what our parents tell us, like your emotions are your responsibility. It is irresponsible of you to say that you're traumatized by an event. Life is hard. You just need to pick yourself up and move on and not be a puddle on the floor, and so on. There's this real stoicism that I find bleeds into the language of people who can sometimes lean more avoidantly attached, as if to say, just like, man up, get over it, move on. And I do think, just touching on this concept of culture, that's very prevalent for so many societies. And it's not just like Western society, it's Eastern society. Like I've spoken to so many people from like England where I'm like, you've got like that gentleman culture, which I think has produced a lot of, dismissive leaning individuals. I think that in certain parts of like Latino culture, Asian culture, you definitely have that hyper masculine approach where people who display more of those feminine anxious traits are sort of seen as like weak or not as worthy or as progressive. And I mean, I'm just speaking from like the stereotypical pejoratives here, but I do agree that I think there is definitely a pervasive culture that encourages this. And so, I think for a lot of avoidant attachers, they may even think like, what the heck is wrong with everyone else? Like, why aren't you able to just shut it down, keep it together like we can with a lot of these issues that are going on?
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean that's our shield, right? Like I'm still working on myself. I still have bad days here and there, and it's because I'm letting myself get more in touch with my emotions and I'm peeling back those layers. And it's not easy. Like it is work. It is constant work every day. Some days I have setbacks. But I keep reminding myself that, I'm not 3 years old anymore. My mother's not leaving me again. So
I was going to say, on that note, Mike, I was going to ask you a personal question. Of course, feel free to just let me know what's out of bounds. But what I was going to ask you is, when I think of someone who has to heal their avoidant attachment, I think it's honestly a bloody hard job. Like, I think for those of us that are more understanding of their emotions because we're more in touch with them, it would probably be a little easier to connect with those emotions. We often say people who are anxiously attached, their journey is to stop focusing on everyone else and start focusing on their own emotional stuff. And sometimes I find it's quite easy for a lot of clients to get there. But I think for a lot of avoidant attachers, it's very hard work to start going into that emotional stuff. And I was wondering, with your permission, if you could share a little bit of light of like what the inner work is like for someone like yourself, because it does sound like it's not a piece of cake by any stretch of the imagination.
no, it's tough. I want to say especially as an FA, it's like revisiting my abandonment wound, getting over that fear of rejection. Um, I mean, with your permission, I do see a counselor on Ken's team, Kate, and she specializes in root cause therapy, which kind of helps you navigate through those memories and revisit them and address them and tell your inner child that it's okay. Um, that was life changing for me. That was exactly what helped me address my core beliefs. Kind of changed everything for me, but they still come up now. It's like I still can't reset back to that shield of hyper independence and neglecting my emotions. So now I have to learn to feel those emotions and then break out of, whatever I'm feeling when it's too much. And I have those tools now, and that's what I'm trying to teach other people as well.
Yeah. And I think that, the way you describe it is like the process is not too dissimilar to what I teach my clients in terms of meeting parts themselves using like internal family systems therapy. But it does sound like if you built if you built like those walls up between yourself and the past, I could imagine it's quite a journey to disarm yourself and to feel those feelings and be like, oh God, like this is very uncomfortable. And I could imagine, it does take quite a lot of resilience and work on it too. And, it just does not sound easy for a lot of people who lean avoidantly attached because they've done such great jobs of compartmentalizing and also having very rigid defenses. Amy, I was going to say, in your opinion, what's your experience also been like? And with your permission, what's it been like for you to sort of unravel, your avoidant tendencies too?
Yeah. I can say that, when I found attachment work, it was life-changing. I mean, I had been in therapy. I'm a person who's always been super interested in psychology and personal development, but I didn't realize how avoidant I was still in those exercises and in those practices because I wouldn't really apply them to myself. I love to learn. And again, that's sort of an FA thing. I'd love to figure people out and see what makes people tick. Once I learned about attachment theory, and the thing that I really love about it is that you don't have to necessarily go back in time and relive in detail your past traumas and kind of get stuck there. But what you can do is look at what is affecting you today. You can identify these core wounds that happened in childhood because they're still present with you in this very moment today. You can find them and then you can reprogram them. And I always like to say it's simple, but it's not easy in that the methodology of healing attachment is pretty simple. It just takes consistency, repetition, these formulas, and intention. Um, but the most amazing thing happened, the first most amazing thing happened when I started doing attachment healing work was I just felt like layers and layers of shame melted off of me. And it was like, oh, this is why I do these things. There's a reason. I'm not just a terrible person. I'm not a bad person. I don't have a bad soul. I'm just extremely wounded. And I'm not a toxic person, but because of my pain, I behaved in a very toxic way in many relationships. And so once you understand, this isn't intrinsically who I am, this isn't my person. It's insane when you do attachment work, how much of your personality you think that is your personality that actually isn't your personality. Sorry if you could follow what I just said.
Yeah.
Um, you think a lot of these things about you are who you are, and then you realize they're coping strategies, they're survival mechanisms. This isn't even who I am. And it is so much just unlearning who you thought you were because of survival to find out who you really are. And it is amazing. It's scary, it's emotional, it can be hard, but it is so worth it because there is such a sense of freedom and pride and peace that comes along with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I think that that feeling of realizing I am not defective, that this is wounding, that I have control over, can be very liberating for many of us who feel like we've been at the mercy of some crazy episodic behavior when we're in relationships too. And I think also feeling like we're getting to the bottom of this and actually able to work on it is really important. I know, Mike, for you, you've been very adamant about this, and I really love the angle you have on this. I know you talk a lot about, the time you spent in talk therapy in contrast to doing more of like the somatic work. Why is it, in your opinion, that one methodology works better than others for attachment work?
Yeah, definitely. So I had probably seen 5 therapists in my entire life, different therapists. Never really made any progress with them. I don't know if that was their fault or my fault. It could have been both. I could have just not wanted to get to the deeper issues, but I mean, you're obviously familiar with the body keeps the score. I think that we
Yeah.
truly hold these traumas in our bodies, and until you approach, until you approach that tension, it sticks in your body, and it's scientifically proven at this point. So, looking into other healing modalities, EMDR, root cause therapy, somatic experiencing, that was the game changer for me, I would say. Yeah.
And I was going to say too, like a lot of those modalities are very trauma informed as well too. And whilst I don't mind a bit of talk therapy just to build a rapport. I think that, in my opinion, you can, spin your wheels doing talk therapy for the rest of your days. But if you don't ever address those root cause issues, we're wasting our time. And I think some people are ready for it and other people are just simply not. It is a case of readiness for a lot of people, and that's totally fine. But I worry that people are spinning their wheels in therapy without at times getting to the bottom of a lot of this stuff. But, such is the case for so many individuals too. So we've talked obviously a lot about, where this comes from, where, what it's like to have this experience. Shifting the conversation now to relationships with people who are avoidantly attached from your experience, I was going to ask, my first question to both of you is, and I'm very happy for either of you to jump on this one too, what would you say is important for our listeners to know about what it's like when you are dating someone with avoidant attachment? Because I think if you listen to the internet, they'll tell you avoid the avoidance, but I don't think that's actually very helpful or constructive advice at all, considering that there are so many wonderful people with an avoidant attachment and it's not all one and the same. So do either of you have any advice that you would like to share the internet in terms of being like, this is the reality of the situation, this is like the expectations, and also maybe some of the boundaries that you need to have for yourself, and also how to maybe show up in a relationship in a loving and constructive way rather than a codependent one?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much information out there about how to make it work, right? In my opinion, it starts with self-awareness. It starts with understanding attachment theory and polyvagal theory. Um, Once you piece those together, you start to understand your avoidant partner's needs, how to communicate with them, how they need to self-regulate. Um, Once you understand that, you don't take it personally when they need to take that space. And I mean, these relationships can work. It's very hard. It might not work. But if it is going to work, you have to understand those things and apply that information.
Yeah, that's such good advice, and it's crucial. Like it won't work without those things. I would say the key to a successful, secure relationship, as far as it's in your control, if you're listening, is to work as much as you can on healing yourself, on healing your attachment style. Because the more securely you show up in a relationship, the more safety you are providing for your partner. And the easier and less painful your own experience will be, because you will not be like you said, Mike, taking everything that the avoidant does or doesn't do personally. And I think that avoidants do really well in relationships with a more securely attached person, or somebody who's very self-aware and working on their wounds, as long as it's an avoidant person who is also willing to do the work. And this is an area that I see so many people getting stuck in. And sometimes we think, if I can be secure enough, if I can just continue to do the work, I can carry the whole relationship. I can be healed enough for the both of us. And yes, yourself being healed and you modeling and expressing in healthy ways is so important and necessary. But you can literally be the Mother Teresa of healing, the most secure person in the world. And if you have an avoidant partner who's not also willing to do the work, some of the work, they don't have to be watching videos every day, but they have to be self-aware and willing to face their own stuff and question themselves, it won't work. And then just one thing, I just wanted to backtrack quickly, Ken, because this is just such an important thing, and I don't think enough people talk about it. And it's that, I want any DAs who are listening to know that if you are in talk therapy, or if you have done talk therapy and you did not feel the needle move and you think that it's stupid and that it's pointless, I hope that you don't give up, And I hope that you just give attachment healing specifically a chance. And I say that because I know that DAs are so practical and pragmatic. And I had a really close DA friend who once said to me, of course, I've tried therapy, and of course, it's stupid. What is some stranger sitting in a room listening to my childhood go? How are they going to help me? Like, it's so stupid, and it feels too vulnerable with not enough immediate payback. And I want any DAs listening to know that attachment theory work is practical. There are tangible tools. It makes sense. You can measure your progress. It's very specific, and there's a lot of science to support it. So it's not just woo-woo BS, I promise you. And there is so, so, so much hope for healing if you have a DA attachment style. And then one more thing I wanted to just say on this subject for everyone listening. It's so important that we understand something. People thrive and they look forward to and they're passionate about doing things that align with their personality, that align with what they think is safe and good and interesting. So it makes sense that for fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupied people to dive in headfirst to attachment healing work, to dive into therapy, to think this is amazing and interesting and so much fun and be so successful at it. So I like to say for an anxious person or a fearful, avoidant, leaning anxious person learning attachment theory work, it's like, and forgive me if this is a stupid analogy, but it's like someone who already speaks Spanish learning French. It's like there's some crossover. It's kind of similar. It's a little easier. For a DA doing therapy and attachment healing work, it's like somebody who only speaks English learning Mandarin. It's a totally different language. There's almost no prior modeling or similarities or something for them to hook onto that makes sense. It is so foreign and it's scary. For an anxious person doing attachment work, they see it as a lifeline. This is going to get me closer to being closer to my person, and that is good and safe. For an avoidant person, they're like, oh, I'm going to do all this work so that it's easier to do the thing that scares me most, which is be vulnerable and, have a committed relationship. So if you are a DA and you're doing this work, so good on you. You should be so proud. And if you're an AP or an FA and you're frustrated with your DA for not doing the work, have patience and understand that it is hard and it is scary to even think about embarking on this journey.
Yeah, to add to that, you can't make anybody do the work. You can't convince them to look inward. Um, there are ways to approach it, but ultimately, if they do not want to change, you cannot convince them, and you have to decide when it's time to walk away. You have to set those boundaries and know when it's time, would be my advice. So just that.
And I think that's a really good thing to add to that point because it's very easy, I think, for a lot of people who are anxiously attached to think that if I do this work, I will have a positive outcome in this relationship. I'll be able to get my ex back. I'll be able to convince my avoidant partner to read attached and then go to therapy and to work on themselves. And that couldn't be further from the truth if that person is not willing to do the work. If you're going to therapy, you're doing it for one person only, you. And at the end of the day, a relationship really in this day and age, is really built on the two people who are, well, depending if it's a monogamous relationship between two people, then it's built on those two people working on it together. And the same can be said for non-traditional relationships too, that are open or poly. It needs all participants working on that experience. It can't just be one. So I agree with what both of you have said. I can see we're nearly coming to time for today, but I actually thought I'd have this quick discussion with you guys before we bounce. And obviously, this is something we can do as part of a part two. But um, I often get really interested in my work with some of the misconceptions with attachment theory. One of which, a very problematic one that I find, is that, anxious attachers will always date avoidant attachers, which, to a degree, yes, that does happen, but it's not always the universal experience. And I know that both of you respectively have had your experiences, dating individuals with avoidant attachment. And I was wondering if both of you could share, you know, even if we don't talk about it in completion today, and maybe we go on to talk about it in more depth at another time, just sort of what your experience of that is like, because I think it's very easy for people to think that avoidants are out there terrorizing one attachment group, which is simply not true. In fact, I've heard of plenty of the opposite happening myself, actually. But I thought it would be good to just, to round out here and ask, what's it been like for both of you respectively when, it's almost been like, oh, wow, now I see what's happening on the other side of the fence. And it's put me into a very uncomfortable position where normally I might be in their shoes, but now I'm on the other side. So keen to hear your thoughts and feelings with that one.
Yeah, exactly what you said. It was that realization. It's like, this is what I've been doing to people. What the fuck? So I mean, luckily I had done a lot of the work already. I had I had dated somebody who's for the first time whose parents were still married. So I was like, this is a good sign, probably had a decent childhood. Um, Took me a few months to recognize the patterns of what I was dealing with. And yeah, I mean, luckily, like I said, I had this knowledge and knew that I wasn't going to be able to change her. I could have encouraged her, attempted to, but I knew when it was time to walk away. And at the end of the day, it was just really, really sad. Just seeing somebody that you very much care for, um, not being able to take that step into healing, especially as somebody who has, right? It's very hard to see, but you just can't dwell on it. So
Wow, yeah, Mike. I totally resonate with what you just said. It's like, oh, wow, this is what it's like to be on the other side of somebody who's kind of hot and cold or running. I had a very karmic experience in that I, most of the people I dated in my early adulthood, before I knew what attachment theory was or had done any healing work, were more secure, but because and maybe a little anxious, or maybe they were anxious because I was FA and maybe a little more avoidant. Um, but truthfully, and one day we can do a more in-depth episode if anybody cares, but I was an extremely toxic partner. I was pretty awful. But I also loved my partners, these two partners I'm thinking of, very, very much. And once that relationship ended, my ex-partner finally was sick of my toxicity and my hot and cold and broken engagement and all of this stuff. Um, I kind of like hit a rock bottom. I hadn't really explored attachment theory yet. I was in therapy. So before I found attachment stuff, I was in therapy, I was feeling awful. I started dating someone. I had no idea like what any of this meant. He turned out to be such an avoidant person, wonderful guy, but very avoidant. And I had no idea what was going on. Everything was amazing in the beginning, and then he would just fall off the face of the earth, come back, fall off. And he didn't really seem to think it was a big deal. He thought this was normal. It was the most dysregulating experience of my life. It was awful. And it is what ultimately drove me to go down this attachment hole. And I'm so thankful for that experience because it brought me here. Um, but it was shocking. It was weird. It was awful. And so, when I have my anxious clients or my FA leaning anxious clients and I say, I know what you're experiencing, I really do understand. And it's funny because I feel like unless you are a person who has been in a relationship with an avoidant or severely dismissive avoidant person, you just don't understand. You don't understand what it's like. It's a very specific kind of pain. It's very you feel like you're hallucinating half the time and you're like questioning your sanity sometimes and thinking, wait, was I really there? Like, did I make that up? Am I losing my mind? And so yeah, it's very hard, it's very intense. And I feel for everyone who's ever experienced it. And I say karmically because I think I really deserved to have that experience after all the nonsense I put my former partners through. Um, but yeah, it's something else.
I saw it as karmic as well. I will say, dating somebody who has a fear of intimacy, would not recommend it. It's probably the worst thing in the world for your sanity. So
Yeah. And the thing is, and like what you said, Mike, it is so freaking true. And it's hard because, right, we found this attachment theory stuff, and we understand, and even as practitioners and helpers of attachment guides, we see every day how much healing is possible for every single attachment style. So then when you're dating someone and you realize how avoidant they are, and they are, avoidants tend to have the least variability in their behaviors and thoughts and emotions, and so they are speaking like out of an avoidant textbook. They don't know it, but they are. And you see, it's like you can write them a treatment plan, or you can give them these books or this information, and you're like, here, heal yourself, like it'll be amazing. But you can't. It's not our job, and you can't make people heal. And if there's one person who you really can't make heal, it's an avoidant. You can suggest it and bring it up, and we can do a whole 3-part episode on how to do that properly. But yeah, it's really important to know, you know, they're probably not hurting you on purpose. Most of us, I don't think, are hurting each other on purpose. We're all just wounded people kind of walking around in the dark. Um, but you can't make anybody heal. And the more secure you are and the more inner work you do, the better positioned you will be to leave at an appropriate time if you do end up in a relationship with someone who's avoidant, who doesn't want to heal.
Yeah, completely agree with both of you. I think that for a lot of people who I've met who are avoidantly attached, when they've gone through an avoidant experience, for a lot of them, it's been, as you described, karmic. I know it was for me, even though I would never identify myself in that way, but it was life-changing. And I'm very grateful that it happened. I still think my ex was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was a very short, fleeting experience. But when I say best, I want to make it very clear. I don't mean like, oh, I want to go back to them and I want to necessarily make it work. It's more to say, it was a very formative experience that I'm glad happened, because it almost was like the universe slapping me across the face, being like, get your shit together and work on a lot of stuff. And by work on my stuff, there was a lot of compassion that was required, a lot of self-forgiveness, but it's bloody hard going through an experience like that. I mean, I'll often say in private that, look, I'm not a particularly big fan of big, loud, anxious attacher protest behavior, the shouting, the intensity, the, overwhelm, and also the violation of boundaries. Again, that's the extreme side, not fun, don't love it. But there is something quite unique to having someone be hot and cold and display those more covert forms of behavior where there is a sudden end to things, or a slow fade, if you will, because it makes you question everything. And I think that it is one of those things where it's very easy to rationalize and go, well, clearly they're just not that into me, when it couldn't be further from the truth. It's a lot more complicated than that. Anyways, just want to round out here by saying thank you both of you for being part of this experience. And I definitely want to continue this again. In fact, I was even thinking maybe we just name this the Avoidant Diaries going forward. So that way we can, share these loose thoughts and feelings and maybe be very structured for next time. But it was really good having you both on. Very quickly. So Mike, where can people find you, and what are you offering for people, as part of your practice?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram. Find my person coaching. I offer one-on-one sessions. I have a few resources through the link in my bio on both of those. So happy to work with you
Amazing. And also, are you working with clients internationally or just in the States?
internationally.
Amazing. And Amy, I know you're obviously part of the team, but very happy to hear your availability and what you're up to as well.
Yes, I'm also working with international clients, which I love so much, and you can book with me on Ken's website. You can find me through all of his links, and you can also follow me on Instagram at Here Comes Healing.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for listening to this episode. We will be back for sure, because I think this is something that I know today was a very formative episode. It was just really about getting the basics. And I think there's so much more depth we can go into, because if there's one thing that I can say about avoidantly attached people is there is a lot of depth, complexity, and very, very, very tender stuff there that I think is part of the reason why we fall in love with these individuals, and also worthy of exploration and compassion, for those of us that are obviously, in a space to do so. So, needless to say, thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure we will be back later.